everyone. We are going to continue with the theme deindustrialization, and as we were discussing the causes of the deindustrialization, we can see that there were plenty of things that were actually happening around that made the scenario really complicated. And with the, you can say, confrontation coming up, that definitely, you can say, encouraged the British cotton over the native, you can say, cotton industry. So that led to a major hit for the destruction of Indian export market as well as the domestic market. Was the decline in Indian cotton industry. Also, it is one of the major factors that contributed to the country's GDP decline by British standards. During the 1600s, the Indian GDP was 60% of the British GDP, and before the end of the 19th century, it reduced to under 15% in correlation. So one can say that these circumstances somehow played a very important role in making this phenomena a more complicated, you can say, process to be looked up. Now, when we are actually talking about them, a major, you can say, question that is going to come to our mind is that how are we going to look at deindustrialization in terms of its impact, in terms of its consequences. So, the major consequence of the deindustrialization process that happened in colonized India was unemployment. The famous handicraft goods that are specially made by the Indians and exported to the global market have lost the competition with the machine-made goods. As they were much cheaper and highly encouraged, it resulted in the devastation of India's handicraft industry and pushed India towards ruralization. So as a result, artisans were forced out of their traditional occupations and they get themselves indulged in agriculture with no other options left to them. The markets were won by the goods that were produced there in the factories of Britain because people realized that the machine-made goods were cheaper as comparison to the handmade goods that were being produced by the Indian artisans. And it actually led to the unemployment that maliciously affected the artisans. The agriculture's efficiency suffered a result of overcrowding. The problem of subdivision and fragmentation of land holding and overcultivation resulted in the concealed unemployment and underemployment. The underemployment and the concept of underemployment were rooted in the occupational structure of India. The number of workers related to the job of agriculture activity was 7.17 crores in 1881. This particular number was increased at the rate of 10.02 crores, displaying the decline in industrial activities. So one can say that from 1881 to 1931, the industrial activities in India declined at a severe rate. The demand for Indian goods in the global market decreased at a significant rate that impacted the poor state of the Indian economy. Now we can say that deindustrialization caused the joblessness of craftsmen and workers of the native cotton industry of India. The jobless craftsmen and representatives depended on horticulture, and it likewise added to the relapse towards farming and brought about the excess work on the land. It is noted that the economy of an Indian village based on traditional culture transformed into a bleeding victim exploited by the British government with their unjust policies. So we can say that the large-scale deindustrialization had far-reaching, you can say, economic consequences that led to the loss of the traditional economy. It played a major role in the country's underdevelopment and increased poverty. So as a result, the process proved to be a disaster for millions of people and Indian economy. Now we are going to move to the major part of the discussion where we are going to talk about the historiography. So when we are going to talk about the historiography, I mean, we just had a discussion there on the causes of the deindustrialization, then we even talked about its impact and the circumstances within this process has actually occurred. So it becomes inevitable to have a discussion on the historiography. It is in this regard a considerable discussion needs to be conducted to see how the plethora of debate broadens our understanding on this theme. So firstly, we will discuss the Indian nationalist perspective. This perspective is adorned by works of Dadabhai Naoroji, Mahadev Govind, Ranade, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, D.R. Gadgil and many others who severely criticized British colonial methods and policies. The destruction of Indian industries as a consequence of colonialism was noticed and analyzed by a range of historians in the 19th century. The first major discussion was initiated with the theory of drain of wealth, which was reflective in the writings of Dadabhai Naoroji and R.C. Dutt. To them, it meant the transfer of wealth from the late 18th century in the form of plunder and loot and unlawful gains by servants of the East India Company, and in the form of home charges, income generated mainly from the taxation of the Indian people, and finally in the form of interest and profits and capital transfer from India to England on private account. So one can see very well that a lot was like taken away, and the home charges and the heavy taxations made the situation even much more worse as it has been otherwise talked about. So it reminds me of a letter that Dadabhai Naoroji wrote to Sunderland in 1905, and he wrote, "The lot of India is a very sad one. Her condition is that of master and slave, but it is worse. It is that of a plundered nation in the hands of constant plunderers, with the plunder carried away clean out of the land. In the case of plundering, raids occasionally made on India before the English came, the invaders went away. The British invasion is continuous and the plunders goes right on." So it speaks a lot about what natives have otherwise experienced when the entire drain of wealth, or you can say the entire process where the influxing of the taxes were like being imposed there on the natives, and a major part of the resources were taken away. So when we go further, we can see that the nationalist critics pointed out how drain in these different forms destitute the country and widened the economic gap between India and England, which was the destination of the drain of wealth. They also pointed out how British regime brought about the destruction of the small-scale industries of India. So it really shows up that the economic gap between India and England was widening, and that was something that was creating a major problem all throughout. Now, when we are actually talking about that, it would be more wiser to look at how the things have been otherwise conceived and foretold to us. So the rate of taxation of agriculture was also criticized by R.C. Dutt, who felt that the burden of land revenue was excessive in areas which were subjected to periodical temporary settlements. In his opinion, this was the main cause of frequent recurrence of famines in British India. So one can see that the taxation that was like being increased there on the agriculture also made the situation, you can say, difficult for the people who were involved there in the agrarian sector, and it led to, you can say, the recurrence of the famine, something that they were otherwise not prepared, and means nobody can even pretend about when the famines are going to occur. So, as we move forward, we can see that the wealth of the countryside was drained away through the revenue collecting policies, making the economic viability of farming so precarious that the farmer could not withstand failure of rain and other natural disasters. So it clearly shows up that it's not that the famine, or you can say failure of rain, happened for the first time, but this time they were absolutely in a scenario, in a position where they were not only naive, but then they felt that they are too helpless to do anything to improve their situation. Finally, an important part of the nationalist analysis of British economic policy in India was their criticism of government expenditure on army, the police and other apparatus of the government. The expenditure was so excessive that developmental investments were absolutely neglected. So it made the situation even more, you can say, problematic, because the entire, you can say, investment, or for that matter, the resources, rather than being spent on the developmental, you can say, purposes, were being spent on the, you can say, on the structuring or for the stability of army, police, and for running the government. Their economic, you can say, nationalism was also developed to counter the claims made by advocates of, you can say, colonialism, who argued that India had developed and benefited by virtue of being ruled by the world's most developed nation, Britain. Subsequently, in the 20th century, K.S. Shelvankar, in the Problem of Money, Problem of India, the Marxist analyst R.P. Dutt in India Today, and many leaders of the national movement repeatedly blamed colonialism for the deindustrialization and resultant backwardness of India. So, one can say that that's how the national perspective has been otherwise thought about. This is how the things have been otherwise conceived around. Now, when we are moving ahead, especially there in the 1960s, David Morris, a historian, reopened the debate on deindustrialization in an article in which he questioned the nationalist arguments and assumptions regarding the decline of the traditional industries in India. Morris argued that there was not much direct evidence shown by nationalists to demonstrate deindustrialization, and the nationalist claims were based more on emotions and ideology than on concrete historical evidence. He claimed that British manufactured cloth need not have necessarily harmed Indian industries because growth in population along with an increase in the purchasing power of the Indians led to an increase in demand for textiles in India. Now, the question that really need to be put up over here is that even though when Morris is actually questioning the major, you can say, integral part of the you can say the argument of the nationalist historians, in his view, the nationalists had actually exaggerated the adverse impact of the imports of British manufactured cloth of India. So that wasn't the scenario. Now, his arguments actually invited a very sharp, steep reaction that was put up by the historians like Bipin Chandra and Tapan Ray Chaudhary, who in their article there in the journal The Indian Economic and Social History Review in 1968, in regard to the issue of the lack of evidence for the decline of Indian industry, they pointed out that the evidence was scattered in different types of sources. So when we are going to see around, we can see that these sources are actually speaking about. And there they talked about the travelers, the eyewitnesses account, famine reports, official inquiries and government reports of the East India Company administration were full of references to the heavy impact of British manufactured goods in India. And that was worsening the condition of the artisans. So when we are looking at these sources, travelers and eyewitnesses account, I mean, who could actually give the better picture than them? The ones who have witnessed it, the ones who have experienced it. So they say that the sources are scattered all around. So when we are looking at these sources, we can see that there was a heavy impact that was like seen, and that ultimately worsened the condition of the artisans. In fact, all evidences point to the contrary. The falling per capita income in the 19th century, mainly because spinning suffered heavily, which was usually done by women at home, mostly to supplement family income. Then the more we are further like going with, Morris also argues that the cheaper British yarn must have been available to Indian weavers, bringing down the cost of production to their cloth to be able to compete with British cloth. In reply to this, Bipin Chandra cited figures to show that the ratio of yarn imports to woven cloth was very low. During this period, the productivity of the Indian weavers remained stagnated, while that of the British weavers was constantly rising. The export price of British cloth fell far more rapidly than the export price of yarn, which made matters worse for the Indian weavers. So we can see that the general criticism that the nationalists have faced is that the statistical evidence for deindustrialization is weak, especially for the period before the census. So one can see that these census statistics are not a valuable store of information about Indian society, and therefore critics always doubted the nationalist arguments of deindustrialization for the pre-census period. Now, whether we agree with what nationalist historians said or not, or for that matter, how they have been questioned on various grounds, and even talked about their accuracy. But one cannot deny that what they were talking about was something that has been witnessed by the natives, and it also speaks about that before, you can say, the pre-census period, when we don't have census reports available to us, then obviously it's also going to create a problem, because how we are going to cross check. So both the ways, the things need to be seen in a broader spectrum. Now we can say that the later historians like Amir Kumar Bagachi managed to get some statistical evidence from sources that were not available to nationalist or Marxist writers. He analyzed the evidence provided in the survey conducted by Francis Buchman Hamilton in Gangetic, Bihar between 1809 to 13 and the census data of 1901. So according to his analysis, the percentage of population dependent on industries was 18.6 in 1809 to 13, which declined drastically to 8.5%. Historians like Marika Vigziani questioned the way in which Bagchi classified Indian society into primary sector, that is the agriculture sector, secondary sector, that is the industrial sector, and the tertiary sector, that is like being seen as the service sector. She argued that in India, especially in rural areas, it was not possible to separate the occupations neatly, as people combined various types of work. Now, defending his methodology, Bagchi argued that in the early 19th century, spinners earned enough to support themselves, and even if spinning did not support spinners fully, it constituted the principal mean of livelihood for them. Other historians also joined the debate, like Sumit Sarkar and J. Krishnamurthy pointed that Bagchi may have overestimated the dependence of artisan families on industries. However, Indian artisans did demonstrate the ability to survive. For instance, many of them shifted to the production of coarse cloth using coarse hand-spun yarn. Other goods like pottery, leather goods, and carpets also existed. So far we were just having a discussion how historians have actually seen the process, their observations, their inferences, and how these sources have been used to, you can say, understand the process better. A very pertinent, a very important question that really comes to us is that if we really have to get into the if we really have to really think about the census data, we can say the lack of census data before 1872 questions the accuracy of the data, which is assumed to be more accurate than in the later period. Several questions have been raised by them that can we say that it's only in late 19th century deindustrialization happened, or for that matter if early 19th century also witnessed deindustrialization, then in the later half did it lead to some growth and stability, or for that matter if we have to believe that traditional industries were able to survive. Now these are pertinent questions raised by a range of scholars that definitely motivate us to look at the broader picture. In the early 1960s, Daniel and Alice Thorner argued that analysis of census data on occupations between the censuses from 1881 to 1931 showed that there was not much change in the proportion of people engaged in industrial occupations. Another economic historian, J. Krishnamurthy, criticized the use of workforce as a criterion and reliance on demographic evidence to arrive at any conclusion regarding deindustrialization. He argued that the use of capital-intensive techniques can lead to rise in output per capita, which there can be a decline in the size of the industrial workforce. However, some scholars suggest that the higher output under colonial condition was for the export market and did not benefit India. Further, any rise in the output was not enough to bring about an all-round industrialization of India, given the general condition of backwardness under colonial rule. So now we are going to evaluate deindustrialization. So in the last 3 decades of number of studies that have shown different emphasis on the extent, impact and nature of deindustrialization in India. These studies have also qualified the assumptions and conclusions of the nationalist and the Marxist perspectives. Recent research suggests that different regions and commodities experience the impact of machine-made goods in different ways depending on whether, when they came under colonial rule, how it actually changed the entire thing. Now, historians like Tapan Ray Chaudhary argue that the condition of the artisan and weavers of the eastern India started deteriorating soon after the Battle of Plassey. He meant deterioration and the deindustrialization was not the only reason behind the destructive state of artisan. So here the concept of timing really comes up. The timing of the colonial intervention played a very important role in that. Historians like Tirthankar Roy has questioned the idea of steady long-term decline of handicrafts in India. He argues that and he puts forth that a decline in traditional industries did occur for most of the 19th century, but also raises a query that how some handicraft industries were able to sustain. So he suggests that many positive forces promoted Indian handicrafts in the late 19th century, which helped in their survival. He says that in the mid of the 19th century, the hand-woven cloth and Indian mill-made cloth faced competition from foreign textile industry. It happened because machine-made cloth proved to be superior and cheaper for the consumption. The Indian weavers overcame this challenge by adapting to the manufacturing of very fine cloth with complex design that primarily dealing with local taste and choices. He further points out that the technological advancements enhanced productivity, the use of the techniques, power loom, new techniques of plating and polishing of brassware, etc., which India was not exposed to, need to be seen at the same time. He further states that there was production shifting taking place from industrial households to wage labor. Handicraft production also showed a shift from rural to urban centers, with growing urbanization in India. So, in short, we can say that industrialization took place at very large scale, which had far-reaching economic consequences, majorly the loss of the traditional industries, which were at a great demand all over the globe. Deindustrialization played a major role in the destruction of country's economy, and underdevelopment also increased the poverty level. So as a result, it is considered as a disaster for millions of people and Indian economy. Thank you.